by supporting Indigenous people in their reclamation to wellness, to reconnect with land, to restore their values, to be able to access, ritual, to celebrate ceremony, and to see that in all of its glory and shininess and the beauty of it all, is something that can be shared because it's the values that bring it all together. So when I think about land back, it's really the restoration of the values we've lost along the way. And this isn't just for us here in Canada, it's global. Every Indigenous, going right back to the Irish, going back to the Scottish, right? I mean, you look at the monarch and what they've done, and it's still happening. And we look at what's happening in the Middle East, still happening. There's Indigenous people. Land back isn't about get the hell off my land. It's not about greed. It's about the restoration of values and that how we look at corporations. It's really the removal of corporations and capitalists and governments who only want to build and monetize off of resources as they see it. Land back is really about the reclamation so we can be human, getting together. And again, it's everybody has their own interpretation. But for me, in my heart, what I try and build is the celebration of diversity. And it's looking at the ecosystems that teach me that.
Come and take a nature walk with me. We're gonna check out some really cool trees. We're gonna hang around and talk about all those things in nature that we can't live without. Let's go get nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature, baby. Nerdy, yeah, let's get nerdy about nature. Come on, let's get nerdy about nature.
What is up, my fellow nerds? Welcome back to yet another riveting episode of the Nerdy About Nature Podchat series. My name is Ross, I'm your host, and today's guest is none other than Rande Cook, someone who has been on the program before. I've spoken with him and Mark Worthing about the nonprofit that they are a part of, lwətaʔ. But today I just have Rande on his own, and I'm really excited for this conversation, for you all to hear this, because Rande is just such a lovely, charismatic, funny guy, and he's so eloquent with words. He has a really unique way of taking a lot of really complex issues and just summarizing them in a very beautiful way. He's known mostly for his carving work. He's an Indigenous carver, but this guy could be a poet with the way that he gets some of these thoughts out. So Rande, I know you'll probably listen to this at least once. You ever think about getting into poetry? I think you'd be good at it. Anyway, we cover a lot of really awesome topics here today, talking about his work as an Indigenous carver, what it was like kind of making a name for himself, the ethics of doing that when the industry standard is to buy logs from your stolen lands that are being destroyed by industrial logging companies, and then just dealing with that. So it's a lot about land back. He talks about his background as the hereditary chief of the Mamtagila Nation in northern Vancouver Island, and it's just a really great progressive conversation that I'm really excited to share with you all here. So without any further ado, let's get into it here with Rande Cook. What's up? How are you doing? Welcome back to the podcast. I'm so stoked to have you. Joined today with Rande Cook, who sat in with me about a year ago with Mark Worthing from lwətaʔ. Would you like to just take a moment and introduce yourself? Where are we right now? What do you do? However you want to introduce yourself.
Yeah. Well, welcome to my studio, buddy.
Yeah, it's great to be
nice
here.
Nice to see you again. Big difference, obviously, from being on the land for sure. But yeah, I'm in my studio right now in Victoria in Lekwungen territory, Songhees. Very grateful to be a guest in this territory where I get to come create a lot of my artwork, bring my kids to school, hang out with friends, build community around, some of the important things that I do for lwətaʔ, and building relationships with humans back into nature and all of that. So this space, actually the studio space, has been working very well for some of those conversations in the city. So yeah.
Yeah, you're an interesting one to summarize. I was talking to a buddy before coming over here. He's like, "Oh, who are you talking to? What do they do?" And it's like, "Oh, his name is Randy, and they do a lot of things." Like it's like, yeah. How did you get into? Because you're carver, or like, how did you get into carving?
Well, I mean, the art side of it, I was always into it.
Mm-hmm.
Drawing from an early age. I was very lucky to have a grandfather who was cultural artist, carver, residential school survivor, a lot of trauma. My hero more than anything. Yeah. So after school, rushing home to go and hang out with him at the table and sit and draw with him. I think were probably some of the most important years of my life because he always would share stories about Monteguila land. His memories of being home. He was a fisherman, very, very knowledgeable, like I say, within culture. He was a dancer, a singer. So I was lucky to be raised with that. I would dance in our potlatches, sing, always interested and how the art was connected to culture. But then what I started to recognize later in years was that the art isn't really a reflection of the culture. It's a reflection of our environment. And it's that relationship with the environment that is the most important. So my grandfather would actually bring me out onto the land and show me when I was quite young where I came from. So even throughout, my early years, he was very, very clear in his messaging, you got to go and connect with these lands, son. He'd be like, this is where you're from. These lands are important. So, yeah.
Well, I feel like that's the bridging gap is like so often in our world today, we isolate our definitions of what a thing or person is. Like, oh, they are an artist. They are whatever job they have as a career. But like so much of it is interconnection and shaped by the world that we live in. And that in turn shapes the world that you end up creating. And I feel like that's a really interesting perspective with you because like your background, like this is obviously like a medium that you use to connect people to like a deeper thing. Like art is just like the medium. What are Monteguila lands? What is this nation that isn't traditionally recognized by the crown as a nation? Like tell me a little bit about this journey that you guys have been on.
Yeah, so the Monteguila are one of the tribes within the Skszwx Nation. The Skszwx span from, just north of Comox, going into Campbell River, lwətaʔ area, and then going all the way up to the border of Rivers Inlet. So 16 tribes within.
So like northern Vancouver Island.
Yeah, northern tip and then onto the, moving into the Great Bear. Mm-hmm.
Just for people who are less familiar with Vancouver.
Geographically trying to map that out. Yeah. So we were at one time the most southern of the Skszwx, but then other tribes started to move down. But yeah, we're right in the Johnson Strait. So, we're right from like Adams River area going all the way into Call Inlet, the northern part of Call Inlet, right into the Great Bear. And then our most southern part of our territory is Port Neville. Yeah. And then moving into north would be Port Harvey, moving all the way into bits of Minstrel and then Call Inlet, like I was saying. So yeah, so if you want to find out, look at a map and look at those place names, you'll know that's very specifically Monteguila territory.
And that's the traditional territory that's been occupied.
Yeah.
How has that been impacted by colonization?
Well, in 1942, when at the peak of like residential schools in Alert Bay, as children were being extracted and taken away, a lot of the communities were left in despair. Parents, chiefs, specifically the hereditaries, were very concerned about their lands. They didn't want to lose their connection to the land. They obviously, for thousands of years, it is our custom, it's our culture. Our positions, our names come from time immemorial. We connect right back to origin stories, right after the great floods. We have stories of our very first ancestors who descended from the heavens, from the stars, transforming from these great mythical beings and taking human form and building the very first house. And these houses are built very specifically, geographically in these areas. And we've known to look after those areas based on those stories, because the stories upon descending as these, great beings took human shape, they started to recognize the power, the beauty, the sustainability that would come from this planet. So we developed an entire system of governance based on the natural laws, and it started to evolve from there. So as we started to intermarry with other tribes, we would strengthen those alliances, but it was all based around resources, protecting the rivers, protecting the clam beds, protecting pretty much everything. Our earliest philosophy was to keep everything living, because we understood everything was actually alive. It is alive. Western science now is like, oh, wow, tree communication is, there, and, on and on. But we're like, no, that we know that. But,
welcome to the party. We've been here for thousands of years knowing this.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's an interesting, it's an interesting time, but we amalgamated with another tribe to strengthen in numbers. And
in like the 40s. 50s.
In the 40s. Yeah. So moving forward, there, the two hereditaries that negotiated that agreement specifically, over the years, they were quite old. They were elders themselves at the time. So moving into the 80s, they had passed on. Nobody was really upholding those positions from a government standpoint. They were looking at like elected chief systems, and nobody was there to represent.
Their hereditary line, you mean? Because it had all been fragmented because of residential schools and everything.
Yeah. I mean, the hereditaries were still going underground. They're potlatching underground, keeping up their relationships strong, still passing rights, in an underground system. But in the elected system, under the federal system, there was nobody to negotiate with. So in the 80s, this new electee comes and expresses interest and wants to look at, this relationship with the government, because, at the time understood the importance of resources. Resource extraction was very prominent and still is, but looked at it through a very economical lens, in a very selfish way, to be honest. And what had happened in the 90s, 1998, I think to be exact, the BCR was written on behalf of that side of the amalgamation, pretty much writing off the entire Montegila from the amalgamation, claiming the land for themselves, stating that's what the hereditary chiefs had wanted. But in 1942, and actually that's the documentation all right there.
Oh, wow.
So in 1942, it took 3 years for this agreement, this amalgamation to pass. All the chiefs were in attendance. They all had to come to consensus. Like they all, wanted to make sure it was all outlined. And by the end of it, even though it was amalgamated, it was very clear each chief would still represent their own land and look after their people. That's what they had negotiated. And then in 1998, not one Montegila chief was present during a BCR when it was written, stating that the Montegila relinquished their sole title, land, resources, everything, and not only to the nation, to one person solely, where he stated specifically it was given to me. And then in the same breath, wrote another BCR stating that he would be the elected chief for life under custom code, that there would be no more...
For life.
And it would pass down to his son after. So a complete dictatorship. So there hasn't been an election in 40 years. Nobody can remove this person. And he has been essentially using the Mamtigila land specifically for just resource extraction and fish farms. The Mamtigila territory in the amalgamation makes up about 80% of the whole entire land mass. So we have greater resources, more land, more,
And it's the same guy who did it in 1998, who's still around.
Still doing it today, and now his son is pretty much stepping into that position.
Okay, so that transition's happening right now.
Yeah.
It's like to hear you first talk about it, you use the term resources, and I'm so uncomfortable with that term, because I think that word has, often in this line of work in this area, it's a negative connotation, because the idea of valuing anything as a resource in today's modern world strictly implies it's like an economic resource, how much you can utilize that, extract from it, turn it into something else in order to make a profit. But when you talk about this kind of older connection, historical connection, the idea of it as a resource, you spoke of it as a resource and then immediately to valuing its health, the clam beds, the forest, all this stuff that. There's just this total disconnect that we've gotten ourselves into, that, and really seeing the way that this individual behaved in 1998, just simple, shows that, where you have this previously really rich connection to things as a resource for more than just the economic values. And then within that time frame, the 50 years since then, it's just been used to look at it from this narrow economic lens. And then you start getting people acting for their own interests over the greater good, over other people's interests. And it just spirals. So what are you doing to combat this? Are you trying to, I know you're currently involved in a case or work to get re-recognized by the federal government. How's that all going?
Yeah, so about 5, maybe 6 years ago now. So I guess to step back, I inherited my grandfather's chieftainship. So I'm a hereditary chief from the xʷməthkʷəy clan. The xʷməthkվəy clan is one of the clans within the Mamtigila. We have multiple chiefs within that clan. Our area resides at Hereditary, which is where the Adam and Eve connect, the river there.
The Adam and Eve rivers.
Yeah, the Adam and Eve rivers.
And Hereditary is the old village site?
Hereditary is the old village site, yeah. So that's where essentially my chieftainship comes from. So for, thousands of years, it was an obligation, by the first ancestor, by those laws, by the governance that we established with the natural laws, to maintain and look after that land. So I started to think about my role as a hereditary chief. And I thought, wow, I don't want to be a chief where it's symbolic. I don't want to talk about historical connections to the land in a way where we're romanticizing about it, and we're still singing and dancing and sharing these very rich ancient songs that talk about our responsibility to the land. I don't want to be opening my treasure box in a potlatch and sharing dances with no connection to anything. For me, that's what makes me feel poor as a hereditary chief. And it feels like I've let go or surrendered more than anything to colonization. So I took it upon myself and went and seek legal counsel. And I took all of my research. I went through all of the papers along with other Mamtigila members also. We gathered and started to look at all the documents and going through everything and looking and the one thing we're looking for specifically was, were there any Mamtigila that had surrendered their title and that relinquished title and signed anything away? And we couldn't find one document, but that's what we were told by the ones who claimed all of our territory. We were always told it was the government that had done it, but really it was a BCR that we had found. And it's a simple document, Band Council Resolution. And it's really quite simple. A band has the ability to reach out to the feds or to the province. They can sign a band council resolution for whatever they need. So we looked at the documentations of that week, and it was Monday. Oh, we're having trouble with the fax machine. Sign in the BCR. Oh, can we get a new fax machine for the office? Tuesday. oh, there's some work that needs to be done on the doors around the office. Can we have some funding that'll help us with, fix the doors and some maintenance around the office? And then Wednesday, oh, the Mamtigila relinquished their title solely over to so-and-so, ceding everything to me. And then Thursday, oh, another BCR. If any future members dispute this, they'll be going against their ancestors. And then in the next breath was like, oh yeah, and the community voted me chief for life. So under custom code, I'm going to be the chief for life now. No more elections, no more nothing. And I'll appoint my brother solely as counsel. So just two people running an entire band system and claiming all 100% of our territory. And then Friday, oh yeah, have we heard anything about, getting a new fax machine and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Literally like that's the week where we lost everything. So in this current time, the Mamtigila territory has been hit by deforestation very, very hard. We're one of the fastest deforested areas in all of BC. And we didn't consent to any of that. We've had fish farms in our territories. Like it's been just a dumping ground, for many things that we didn't consult with. But anyway, so going back, I went and got a lawyer. And I brought all of this information forward with one question. Do we have a case? Like, do we have an opportunity here to defend what is ours? And the lawyer immediately was like, 100%. It's like, nobody has the right to just jump in our neighbor's car and drive off, without consequences and feel like, oh, I'm just going to take this car. It's mine.
With a handwritten note by yourself saying that the owner gave you permission.
And nobody has the authority. Not one person has the authority to sell any land at all, Indigenous land. So where we're at now is the neighboring tribe who's run off with the car is in treaty negotiations trying to sell 100% of Mamtigila land for $100 million to buy new land in a city that they're not even from, just because that's where they live and it'll be comfortable for their family.
Right, and that's what I'm talking about, like that shift of like resources valuing. Like you no longer value your connection to it. You're looking at purely how much you can make off of it to better yourself in the short term. Yeah, exactly. So from there, I mean, for myself, because we're not recognized by the Crown, I have no means of finding funding, like nothing to help get my people back on the land, to get youth on the land, communities doing good work, no support from the government. No support from government. Yeah. And so we're really lucky that we had the opportunity to start lwətaʔ Foundation. And the lwətaʔ Foundation has been that bridge between us and philanthropists, other organizations, creating community around the messaging. But really it comes back down to is that the Mamtigila don't want to sell their land. We didn't relinquish anything. We still uphold our values, our governance within potlatches. We're still very active on the land. We're using it. So now the lwətaʔ has been able to get people on the land to create programs through Tree of Life, looking at partnerships with like Mother Tree Network on restoration work, regenerative projects within forestry. We're looking to partner in different ways now where we can restore root gardens. And then what we're looking at next is how do we develop our own economic models that'll help us sustain in our own lands so we can continue to grow and pave pathways for future generations so they can remain. And it's really about getting our people off reserves. It's breaking that old colonial structure of saying, oh, we're only entitled to this, and saying, no, all of this. And we're not doing it solely based out of like selfish reasons in any sort of way. It's going back to that ancient messaging that we were taught from our very first ancestors, is that this land belongs to everybody. We just have to make sure that we respect it. And that governance that was established from the very beginning is that, you know what? It's going to provide for us if we look after it. And we've always known that. And that's why I say that our ancient philosophy goes back to keeping everything alive. Like we harvested standing trees. Like we didn't kill anything. We always knew there was a spirit living within it all. And if you go and you tend to that relationship, it's going to provide.
So I think all of the work we're doing right now is to really open up the awareness, not only for us as Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people, and how we can come together and share in these value systems. That currency, which was introduced to us as Indigenous people through the fur trade, which colonized our culture heavily, and it still does. We still heavily rely on systems of colonization culturally, which holds us back. It keeps us pitted against each other. We're not finding any progress, nor are we finding any ways of healing with each other in relationship, because we're still hanging on to these colonial frameworks that have been integrated into our system, which creates a ranking system, like who's greater than who, and who can speak, who has more power and ability over resources, who can speak to resources. And all of that infiltrates into these band systems, where then bands feel like they have the power to be able to negotiate with industry, and then just keep agreements going on and on for pennies on the nickel, essentially, where nothing's going back in the community and the people don't have a voice. So what we see globally is what we've been seeing as Indigenous people in our own communities for, a few hundred years. Like, nothing has really changed at all. And that's where I'm trying my best to restructure and bring people back. And I feel, we can do a good job if we can share those value systems, not only just, in the revitalization of who we are as xʷməthkվəy, but the revitalization of who we are as human beings.
Mm-hmm. I think that's the most toxic aspect of colonization. The most horrible thing about it is that, yes, it does infiltrate, creates these deep roots, but then it has a way of superseding everything, Have you read The Serviceberry by Robin Wall Kimmerer? She speaks about this reciprocity, this relationship building that you talk about, keeping things living, and kind of this gifting thing between everything, where you're the exchange is in what you can offer the other for the betterment of the other person, and you happen to benefit from that at the same time. It's not a currency. And when you're talking about this focus on currency and how much money can be made, ends up superseding, and that's a colonial construct. And the same way, you haven't left the land, you're still part of the land, yet the government, the federal government of this colonial empire of Canada, doesn't recognize that, and yet that supersedes the law. So somebody else has full say and control over what of your resources get sold to an extraction company, whether it be mining, fishing, logging, it's just that toxicity is so pervasive on every level. How do you feel? How does that, you're living in a world that where you don't exist by the dominant empire structure. That's got to be a pretty daunting thing to go up against.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's frustrating, and there's moments where I question even the work that I do, because it is so daunting. I think about my well-being and my health, and I'm like, God, is this what I want to be doing for the rest of my life? Because you live in turmoil, you live in moments of doubt, you live in moments where you're looking at everything as an obstacle sometimes. And it takes a lot for me to constantly be solution-based, where I'm wanting to pull myself out of situations, re-examine it, look at it in a different perspective, change my thought patterns. And I think that's the beauty sometimes about being an artist, is that I get to be that creative person, be the visionary. But we are, as Mamtigila, in this moment of erasure. We have an entire system around us that is working very hard to erase who we are. And we can, it's no different than some of the things that are happening globally in this time of war. We're in a war right now, and this is where I think sometimes Canada is one of the most stealthiest fucking places in the world when it comes to Indigenous people, because they've had a war on us for so long, but it's the most silent war that you'll ever know of.
Just totally normalized.
Because it's just normalized, and it's just extracting and pushing and silencing and saying, you don't have any say. The system put us onto reserves, and we're complacent. And to try and combat that, try to come out of that in some sort of way and try and vocalize that this isn't right, puts me and others, in situations when you are vulnerable of, almost at a breaking point, because you have your own people challenging you and being like, what are you doing? Why are you being disruptive? We're in a system that's working. You're going against the band's wishes. You're going against community. And meanwhile, you're like, well, no, actually, I'm just trying to see beyond the border of the reserve here. And I'm looking at the land and it's being completely destroyed. I know it's ours. Nobody's saying anything. You guys feel it's okay because maybe you're going to get 0.05% of that in a return, while they're taking billions out, and there's no future for us to sustain, and we're not going anywhere, and we've been here for thousands of years. But meanwhile, industry can move. They can sell and go and be wherever they want and go to another country. They don't care. So it's like dropping a bomb, completely fucking decimating everything. And we have to try and clean up the mess. But we're at a point where, what if you can't clean up that mess any longer? And we've reached that point where there's a point of no return. So the scary part right now is when you try and speak to your own people in that way and saying we have the right. We're allowed to say something, we're allowed to go and fight for those trees if we want to. We're allowed to go and harvest, we can go and use that clam bed just because it's not on reserve. We don't have to ask somebody.
Yeah, because the reserve is a colonial established thing. You were never reduced to this one pocket of land.
Yeah, exactly. But the sad part, though, is when you go back to those clam beds and you see how toxic they are now, from a lot of the different machineries in the area, where they're, again, whether they're fish farms or industry from logging, a lot of them are contaminated. They need a lot of work, restoration work. And I think, again, so with the Wheat Foundation, I was talking about restoration work. That's exactly what I'm looking at, is how do we get back and start using those areas, restoring them, harvesting from the game, and start pushing, industry out just by being there, by occupying it.
It's funny, the clam bed issue, because I know a lot of those companies that do the polluting are looking to clam beds as a solution to the pollutants, because they're filter feeders, they clean the air, or they clean the water, and people are like, yeah, this is a way to clean up our areas. And I get that. It makes sense from an ecological perspective, but that even in itself is short-sighted, because you're not looking at the cultural impacts that has. So it's yeah, have the filter feeders, clean out all the toxins from the water. But if you still can't eat the filter feeders, if you still can't eat the clams, what's the point?
Yeah.
I guess that makes a good segue between you and the art you're doing. You're talking about the art, being an artist is a visionary, being able to see a different future. It's sci-fi in a sense. And you do a lot of really cool pieces. So yeah, I guess maybe you should talk about it, because it's traditional but modern, and tell me about it.
Yeah. No, absolutely. It's interesting when, people, I've been in this for 25, 30 years now. I've sold in commercial galleries. I've worked my way through. I've studied, I did an apprenticeship with a master carver for 6 years, worked with my grandfather. When I was first starting out, there's not a school in the world that would validate our art form as being an actual art form. They only looked at it as craft. So a lot of the universities, when I was wanting to go to school and explore a relationship with, with art schools, and then trying to bridge with culture and our art forms, there wasn't any support at the time. So I went and worked with a master carver instead. I thought, well, I'm not going to go to school. I don't know why I'm going to waste time in some colonial institution when I want to be just working on the things that matter to me. So I worked with an apprentice for 6 years. And for me, it was God, it takes you can get a master's and a PhD in 6 years if you're committed. And I was working 9 to 5, sometimes 7 days a week. And it immersed me fully into the commercial market. And I learned a lot about the commercial market because it taught me about capitalism at its finest. I got to see the world through that lens, where not only learning about, the economics, but also where the materials are coming from, how the materials are used, and how they're just going into market. There was no difference from looking at the international trade market in any sort of way and looking at the economics behind Canada and the way we look at our, again, resources and the way we extract for that sole purpose. What percentage is actually going back to the land? What percentage is going back to those communities? Not much at all. So it goes back to like resource extraction, maybe 0.05% a community will be able to get from clear cutting one of their traditional territories so they can get housing and on and on. So in the commercial market, I was making art and I was taking it to galleries. They were buying it at 50%, selling it at 100. So 100% markup. And I was looking at where I was getting my materials. At the time, I was trained that you had to go and buy a log from industry. So I had to go to a logging sort.
Because they own the resources,
because they own
unquote.
it. Yeah. So I was going and buying a log and milling it and getting materials I needed. And I was like, wow. And I didn't put a thought. And then I was putting it into market. And a gallery was dictating what it needed to look like. So they wouldn't buy anything contemporary at the time. They said, no, it has to look this way.
It has to look traditional.
Because that's what we're trying to sell here.
It's the product.
We're selling the product of not only of what the product is of the product, but, this image of what Indigenous people look like or are in this province. And I found I fell into that wheel for a bit. And I remember like trying to understand the feeling it was giving me, but I knew it wasn't right. And I knew everything about it was wrong. And the longer I spent in it, just felt more gross to have galleries critique my work in such a way. Sometimes galleries would even take the art and go and give it to another artist to repaint it to make it look traditional without even telling the artist.
No way.
Yeah.
That is...
And it's still happening.
It's like taking a brand new pair of jeans and throwing it, because it's like fancy to have it acid washed and ripped up, but then not even telling.
Yeah. And not even giving credit or anything, not acknowledging the artist. So the artists aren't important in this market. It's about the product only. And keep the product going. And, a lot of them, it's a very lucrative market too. A lot of people make a lot of money off of it. So, but none of that money goes back into the community. None of that money really supports the artist family, because there's not that much. By the time the artist has to travel to deliver their work, if you're coming from Haida to Vancouver, you got to pay for that.
And gallery fees, depending on who's hosting it.
Well, then the artists got to pay for their time, their materials. If you're buying from industry, there's all these markups. So, to buy a log, for example, at $10,000 to do a totem, and you're going to make $30,000 off of it. The gallery is going to sell it for $60,000. They clear the $30,000, but out of your $30,000, you're hiring friends, you're running your saws, you're running your everything. And most of the time, the gallery has it sold before they even get it into their gallery anyway. So it's a phone call and it's shipped right to their home. And they do that 10 times over with 10 different artists. They sit back and collect. So
this sounds like an extractive industry.
Right? So there you go.
Funny how it,
yeah.
all these parallels.
Exactly. So I was sitting in it and I pulled the plug and I was like, I can't work like this and then I started to put more time into, being on the land, thinking about my relationship with the land as a hereditary chief. And I started to think about, bringing our people back, but protecting what is left of our old growth, making a very clear, statement saying I won't support industry. I won't never buy a log again, telling galleries that I won't take a commission based on anything like that. There's a lot of artists where like, Rand, you're crazy. Like, you're shooting yourself in the foot. Like, this is our bread and butter. Like, we need to live. And I just thought,
this is the model. This is the way it's always been done.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I had to make a choice. And I was like, I know this is tough. It might set me back. I might have to struggle really hard to try and find alternatives. But when I was out there, I started salvaging. I started looking at what was around. And I thought, well, all of this discarded wood, I'd rather take from that and turn it into something. But whatever I turn it into needs to be a message. So that's where I started to switch things, because my work is very contemporary, but I started drawing from stories from where we are now and what the struggle is now. And I started thinking 100 years ahead and thinking, what is the message I want in my work? And if somebody 100 years from now looks at it and says, wow, Rande Cook took this wood and put a message in this for us right now based on regeneration, based on the things that they needed at that time in order for us to sustain. And here are some of the tools he left within his work in order for that to happen, And I kept thinking that way, where I'm like, we can be a part of the solution, and artists can be a part of the messaging, which we should be, but we have to be presenting something for the future. And I don't want to be one of those artists that replicates. So what I started to find was, going into museums and replicating masks and replicating these objects just for commercial reasons was the most craziest thing. And artists do this. Like, artists go and they study and they replicate and they bring it as close as they can into a gallery so they can sell it without understanding how that mask in the museum came to be. So when I started to go to the museums and look at objects, and as I was studying them, it wasn't the aesthetic beauty that I was looking at. I started to ask the question of, like, what is the information in these masks? Like, what is the most important? I was like, in order for this mask to be here, somebody had to go into the forest in solitude, be committed, and they would fast for 4 days. And they would go for walks up into the glacier. They would bathe first thing in the morning. And then in between, they were meditating. And then through meditation, they're reaching higher consciousness. In that state of higher consciousness, they were tapping into the vibrations of that forest. They were listening to the language and communicating with that forest. The plants were informing them. And then through this time, as they were preparing, through these rituals, as they were preparing for ceremony, before that ceremony, then their vision would come based on the gifts of that forest. And whatever the person was feeling, they would feel the song come to them. They would go to a composer and say, here's a tune that came to me in the forest. Those professional composers would make a song for that dance. And if they had a vision, they would go to the artist and express what they had felt or what they saw in that time. And the artist would carve that into a mask. That mask and dance would be celebrated in a potlatch, and that was the gift that that person was bringing from their personal quest, their personal moment. They would bring that in, and that belonged to them. That was from their vision, their experience, So I started to think, I'm like, how are we ever going to be a living culture if we don't have a forest to go back into, to tap into, where through the impacts of colonization, we're limiting ourselves as human beings on our full potential because we're just living in urban spaces and not caring. We're going day to day. Whatever's in front of us, consume. Whatever is taught for us to think or feel, that's what we see. We're not allowing ourselves to reach our highest potential. So I was like, and it all starts there for us as Skszwək. You have to go into those forests and feel the life and vibration. The gifts will come to you. So as a young initiate was going through these rituals, they would harvest the bark from the tree, turn that bark into their sacred ceremonial regalia, and they would wear that but that was the relationship they formed with that tree for the rest of their life. So that's their reset also. So no matter what's happening in their world, no matter how much turmoil or whatever they're feeling, they could go back to that forest and go and reconnect with that very specific tree. And by pulling the bark, you've released the spirit of that tree out because it is alive. It is communicating with everything around it. You felt it through the vibration of your fingers and your body and it taught you about the medicines. It pointed you in the right direction of how to use things. But once you form that relationship, then you're going to want to protect that. So you always go back. So those ancient relationships are there. And that's what these masks represent. Everything in the museum, by extracting and taking that away from us, was that barrier between us and the natural forest, like the natural elements, everything, but also the ability for us to escape dictatorship and all of these ways of thinking, because that's ultimate freedom. If you can get to a place where you're not thinking about currency, you're not thinking about anything else, it's really about the essence of life, then you're in something, because now you're there of service. You're going to protect this. You realize through that communication. So we would bring young initiates in to actually prepare them, because they're the ones who are going to be the next chiefs. So the next line of chiefs were raised with these rituals, and that's why a chief will give everything away in his potlatch, is to exemplify that these are just material things. I'm already full. I'm whole because I've already seen pretty much the rest of my life. I'm in communication with something that is far greater than anything, like I know now what a reset. I know my life expectancy. I know, like, I can see, like, I'm full. And I feel like, those are such beautiful things that we need to be hanging on to. But that's what my art all comes back to, is how do I integrate the information back into my work? So when I'm creating work now, I'm thinking about that first. Is the information translating? Is it getting to people? So I'm not replicating. I refuse to go into a museum and replicate a mask, because those belong to somebody and they're sacred, and that's somebody's journey. So I'm trying to get back into the forest, and I'm trying to restore, and I'm trying to maintain and protect as much as I can, but tap into those vibrations. But simply by looking at my surroundings in real time, I'm like there's a seed sculpture here that is very symbolic of like root gardens and some of our forests. And I'm thinking, how do I create objects that will remind people that the seeds are already in the foreground? They just need stimulation. We just need to go and cultivate again. We need to be there. There needs to be presence. So I'm trying to create a dialogue through my work all the time that is very reflective on everything else that is happening.
And that's true art, is when there's like messaging in it. I think like, oh, there's so many layers to everything you just said. I'm like frantically trying to jot down notes to circle back on things. But like, I think one of the things that like came to mind for me is that like this idea of art, when you look at this type of art, like this piece behind you on the wall, like it is highly complex, highly detailed. There's so much to it. And we look at like the evolution of art in any culture around the world, like high quality fine art, quote unquote, develops when you have communities of abundance, when you have those resources that you mentioned earlier, like they're able to feed people, keep people well housed, clothed, make them comfortable. Then you can put resources into expression and creating art of any kind. Like this isn't just like, a cave painting, but like the Pacific, like North Coast kind of art has this really unique look to it because of the abundance that came from the lands. And then when you speak about the stories and how those lands created the art through the connection to the lands, and then the severance of that, when you have people just going in and copying works in order to kind of meet this like colonial stereotype of like what Indigenous art is or should be from this era, you're no longer evolving the art. And that's what I find so refreshing about the work that you do, is because it's like hearkening back to these like traditions and like the same style of art, but then also evolving with it, like there's so much of the story that is like, it's evolving in a contemporary way. And it's not just like, trying to replicate the things that were done in like the late 1800s when colonizers came here. Cause like that art at that time, like wasn't even like, peak quack art, cause there had been variations prior to that, like 200 years before, where all those pieces eventually, decayed and went back to the land, because that's all life is. So tell me, like, when you, like these pieces, like the seed, for example, this is all salvage wood from Monteguila territory.
No, they're from different areas. I support other artists also. Like I support other nations who are salvaging materials. I would rather give them money. So I'm putting money actually back into communities who are wanting to also salvage. So again, it keeps money away from industry and government. So I'm actually working that way also. And then I'm trying to create opportunities for others in Monteguila territory where we can even be salvaging and creating programs. So one of the ideas that I had was for the amount of artists that are buying logs from industry, none of them are asking where the log comes from. And what happens is they get the log into their studio. They'll say a prayer over this log, sprinkle eagle down, and then talk about a really sacred moment before they start diving into it, thanking the log, but not thanking the territory where it came from, not thanking the people who are suffering, trying to fight for that log, like such as us. And Monteagle are one of the richest in resources on Vancouver Island, and most of the logs on Vancouver are coming from our territory. So they're going into this market still. And so it's a really hard, like a difficult conversation for me to have with artists, knowing that when I see some sort of ceremony happening where I'm like, we're fighting for everything we have. I wonder if you've ever even asked where that log came from. So I thought, what if we were to create an opportunity for artists where we said, because as we know through plantations and in Monteagle territory, everything, if you're going to replant fir, for example, over and over and over again, we have very condensed dry areas. And we're seeing now logging practices now, third growth moving into fourth growth, where you're not supposed to log anything younger than 65. We're at 30 years, So we're seeing this in real time. And I'm seeing the loss of diversity in our forests at an extreme rate. And I'm thinking, wow, like, what if there is an opportunity for Monteagle to work with artists specifically where we select very specific trees, but they have to pass. It can't be just for commercial, but if you want to carve a canoe for your people, so you can go on the canoe journeys and it creates community, we can supply a log for that. If you want to create a totem that's going to honor your family, it's a memorial, you're going to stand it, or it's going to help you build a big house, we can supply and support that. Your money then comes into Monteagle territory, and then we create an economic model around that where we plant in very specific areas cedar. And then we can start, continuing the process where we're like, okay, we can pick areas where we can just grow cedar to support our artists. Because I just kept thinking, I was like, we're hooped in the next 50 years. Like artists right now, one of my friends, came and he said, Rand, I tried to order a log from industry, $40,000.
For how big of a log?
For a 40-foot log.
40-foot long.
Yeah. $40,000. And, that's the reality. And he goes, yeah, but when I called for it last year, it was 20. But this year they said, oh yeah, 40. And he's like, what the hell? You said 20
that's
last year.
Global supply and demand.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, that was last year's prices. The market shift. The other thing is a lot of artists now can't find cedar. And, and they're wanting old growth. They want the tight grain. They want to, now they're getting, second growth. A lot of them are frustrated as professional artists in the market because then it's not what the galleries want. And then the galleries dictate to their clientele, and the clientele's like, oh, well, what's happened here? Oh, there's a blemish in the wood. I don't think I want it now because, I want pure gold, like just one solid, beautiful. Like that's where the market's at with artists. It's really just interesting in a lot of ways. I'm not saying like this is something we're developing around like the replanting of like cedars and stuff, but they're thoughts that I'm thinking about right now that will help some of our artists, and not only that, our community, but also it's just how do we utilize opportunities to bring back the diversity that is needed for a healthy ecosystem. That's the main goal. So I'm constantly just trying to strategize for that reason first, is that we need a healthy ecosystem.
Yeah. Because even those plantation forests, when you plant them again and again and again, like you get resource depletion if you're not having that diversity, and not just in the trees, but or the conifers that we demand for all this like lumber and art and everything. It's like you need the deciduous trees, you need the understory,
Absolutely.
You need that complexity in order to create healthy trees in the first place.
Yeah,
we've lost a lot of that.
Absolutely, and it's what we've lost in community. We need diversity. We need thinkers. We need the engineers. We need the scientists. We need the artists. But yet, we're all taught to think this exact same way, and again, we're just pitted against each other. And we're not doing
and operate
anything.
in silos where industries are just like kind of working against each other. Cause it's like, no, those are like, cause you talked about the 30-year, fourth time being harvested plantation forest. Pulp and paper loves that. That's their go-to. But like them having market kind of demand or control over that keeps that forest from ever evolving past 30 years, So how do you create multiple values, like value stakeholders over these landscapes that like provide us with so much? And then also like the non-human people who have a stake in it as well, whose voices never come to the table.
Yeah. There's I was thinking about, traditionally we would bury our people in trees, in bentwood boxes. So we had our burial areas. And when I started to think about some of those areas, and going back now because of looting over the years, a lot of these traditional boxes and stuff ended up in museums or sold into the black market. A lot of charms and things found in boxes were found to be very valuable to collectors in different ways who pay a lot of money for them. And I've seen in the black market some of these pieces fetching, in auction now into the millions. And, and what's happened by removing those objects and putting value on them, it's opened up those areas also for being extracted. So going back and looking at old burial sites, and you're like, wow, it's logged, some of these big, beautiful trees. But what we're missing, even as Indigenous people, when we think about salmon forests and you look at the DNA within trees, our DNA is literally in those trees. We're in that land. So as the bodies would decompose and fall, we're feeding that forest. So even our human connection, to even go back to those ancient forests and to core those trees, you would find our DNA in them. Like that's, again, comes back to that, the early understanding that everything is alive and everything's reciprocal. We need the forest as it needs us. So it goes beyond pulling the bark and saying a prayer where you're one with it. It's actually the cycle of life too, where we understand as Indigenous people that the physical is really just the vehicle. There is a lot more to this, and we need to keep our mind open to that. And I'm always thinking about the word spirituality, and what is spiritual? If you don't have that connection and understanding for longevity and to protect something, what is spirituality? It's not a stopping for a moment and saying a prayer. Not if you're going to be a part of the change. We have to be invested in a way, but we have to understand deeply that there is a pulse within Mother Earth. There is a heartbeat. It is a living organism. We know this. We're just one part of it. Biodiversity, everything. We all need that. And that was just, again, for me, that understanding through these ritualistic practices as xʷməthkվəy, we understood that to the point where through higher consciousness, we would astral project. We would see the world in a different way, and it came out in our songs. I remember looking at or listening to Hamatsa songs and being like, wow, and we talk about flying a lot. And I was like, oh, it hit me after a while. I was like, oh, it's not meant to be taken literal. It's actually through ritual. Because in that process, when you go to singers and you start talking about what it is you saw, and they're like, oh, and you're telling that composer that you were seeing the world in a different way.
It's like bird's eye view on everything.
Bird's eye view and everything. And they're like, okay. So then in the lyrics and everything writing, it's like, I flew around the world. I saw this. I flew. I was unstoppable. I flew. I was high as can be, And I was like, okay, these are really significant moments in these individuals' lives who were deeply connected and understood, and therefore understood the importance of protecting not only culture, family, community, on, but also looking to the rivers for sustenance, looking to the salmon, understanding that, by doing that, you're going to have a healthy ecosystem where eagles are going to be able to feed bears, on, and bears will contribute to healthy, ecosystems too. They need healthy dens and on. It's interesting because it's not rocket science. It's just fucking common sense.
Totally. Once you start getting into it. But I think the thing that people have generally nowadays, broad generalizations here, is that because of the people that have been raised in and come from this structure of society, you don't value that because of that inherent disconnect we have and that siloing of everything. You mentioned earlier how art has become this thing that people just consume and put on their walls, and in a way the colonial kind of framework of this kind of art, the gallery model, is that you have carvers who have an idea of what they want to put out, and they get a log that they don't know where it comes from. They don't have that connection to story like you mentioned, like people going onto land and creating stories from the land. And then there's like the biochemical element where there's not connection to actual physical ancestors in that wood. So you're like reducing all these steps to get a product where like, oh, I'm going to carve this thing because it's going to sell well at this gallery. And then it just becomes like a commodity that someone can buy. And then you look at like the way AI, like fortunately AI can't carve yet, so like there's this reduction in the quality because there's so little time focused on the story, on the connection, and it just becomes like another consumable good. Like how, like I understand the way that you are doing it, but how do we as like a kind of like global community like work to better do this, whether it's consuming or whether not, I don't even want to say the word consuming, whether it's like getting and supporting artists, but then also like finding ways to bridge these connections between whatever field that they work in, that people work in, whether you are, plumbing water from a river to go into someone's house, looking at rainwater catchment. I don't know, whether you're like making and selling bicycles and snowboards, like any industry that you're in, like how do we get better at like bridging this community and seeing and getting that bird's eye view?
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's the best question for today, and I think that's what's happening again with majority of the citizens who are suffering, who are looking for peace and understanding and just to feel validated in their own truth. And I think for us, again, like as Indigenous people and myself as an artist, I want to be working and supporting artists now who feel the same way. With a lwətaʔ Foundation, for example, we have, 4 pillars: arts, Western science, Indigenous knowledge, transformation. All of these pillars hold up the foundation itself, metaphorically, and and if we think of a physical structure like a house, our big houses have 4 big totems in there, and those totems tell stories, and they go back to origin stories. But they all work together, and that's the governance. That's why we gather. That's what creates community. That's why we feast, and we feast to celebrate, that we've maintained our resources and so on. So I'm trying to look at my practice right now as an artist. At first, my practice helped me do all of this work. I was selling my own personal art pieces to pay legal fees. I was selling my art pieces to get my people on the land. Like
legal fees for lwətaʔ, like to challenge the government on your recognition.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So I was working with clients like specifically and being like hustling and being like, I need some money to do this. And then the next year I was like, I'm going to make some money so I can pay for boats and rent boats and get people here. I'm going to pay for like food. I'm going to pay for people like transportation. I was literally selling an art piece every time to make that happen. So I was really lucky actually when the foundation kicked in. I was like, oh, we have charitable status. Now people can support the foundation. And now I'm thinking, how do we create jobs for artists just to create and keep the narrative going so that it can bring awareness, and people who do want to support can actually, put money into an artist not having to struggle and pay for his life through a commercial market where there's nothing in connection. What if that artist was working from the land and building like studios for other artists to be there, and then standing guardian poles in areas to protect them and to talk about awareness and relationship and salvaging materials, but selectively working. So, looking at different models now where people can like say, hey, I want to support an artist to do that amazing work. And then in an unselfish way of saying, maybe I don't need to go to a museum today. Maybe I just need to go for a walk in a forest. And what if there's a beautiful sculpture there I actually contributed to? And that sculpture now is protecting that entire area and bringing its people back. It's telling a story now that has been there for 10,000 years. We just needed a reminder. I feel pretty good if I put some money into that, considering hanging on a collection, that's only gaining value for, for a stock market price or whatever
and
it might be.
A very select few of people who are going to like, not necessarily appreciate that, but like purchase that,
Yeah, exactly. So if we can develop, new ways of thinking and bringing people together, and it's not just the arts. It's like, if you want to help support housing crisis. You know, there's a lot of land on the outside of in ancient villages where people want the revitalization. They want infrastructure. They're desiring it. And if you want to support Indigenous people with addiction, nature, like everything comes back to just identity. Bring them back and help them restore their identity. Get them back onto their land
with resources and services. Yeah.
Have them with their story and their people and their families. They're gonna shift like so dramatically, and it's gonna give them a sense of purpose, because the reason they're on the street is because of gang colonization, gang capitalism, all of these things that put barriers in front of us because they can't pay bills, or they're stuck on a reserve with a small, without access to education and all of these things, or all these things that have like kept us down. But the land is the education. Like, once we step out of these old colonial institutions and the way we look at education also, this regurgitation of history that has only been in place to teach us about, what empowerment is through capitalistic mind frames. I mean, get everybody into that, break down these systems and start looking at the real value around that. But it's really the value of life. It's the value of how we communicate, the value, restoring all of that will help us to find pathways again, and how we can start to put it back into Mother Earth and value it again. So it's these governments and corporations, that are just moving way too fast.
Well, and it's like for Indigenous people, yes, but for non-Indigenous people as well. Like I feel like these settler communities, like so many of them, I've watched how many people just walk by in this time. So many people just in kind of like a mindless monotony, just a rat race, just doing what they need to survive. Like I feel like this is a thing that everybody would benefit from.
Yeah.
Going back to, like I mentioned earlier, like this type of art evolving from like great wealth of like resources and quality of life, the way that it has been reduced in recent years, in the past 50, 100 years, is almost kind of symbolic of the kind of starvation that we as a society are feeling. Like everybody's feeling the pinch from resource extraction. Like when nobody has enough, everybody's trying to just like continue to make rent and exist. Meanwhile, you have like the kind of 1% of people who are just like profiting like mad off of this and creating such a such a divide between like different income brackets, and it's all just like a manufactured kind of like fake wealth that is shallow, that is temporary, it is impermanent, like it is nothing has quality to it, or very little does. So it's really nice to hear people talking about ways to do things differently. And in listening to your last like little spiel, I'm like, wow, Randy's so progressive. But then I'm like, okay, in my mind, like, is this progressive? Because like all the ideas you're saying aren't necessarily new. It's just like, it's like the old way of doing things. Like, do you consider yourself more progressive or more of a rebel? Because I almost feel like rebel is like the better word to use.
I know, it's funny, actually. I was thinking about that years ago.
Progressive versus rebel?
Yeah, I was thinking like even, like being a futurist, right?
Right.
And I was like, man, all I'm doing is I'm going actually not back. So probably the word decolonization. What does it mean? And I started to listen to different interpretations of, people's perspectives, like, what they think decolonization means. And I had to ask myself, I'm like, well, it's different for everyone. So I'm like, so for me, I was like, I started to go back to ancient stories, the early stories, way before contact. And I started to reimagine like what life was like. But I was like, obviously time has changed. I'm not a romanticist. I'm not going to try and, go back and live in a very specific way. But what can I bring with me? And I was like, if those teachings are there, I was like, then that's all we need. We just need to bring those teachings forward. And that's really how you build community. And I'm like, we're surrounded now with technology that we can utilize to our advantage. We can 3D print, but pulling from materials that may be more organic based or more, helping to contribute and help communities to sustain in different ways. So I started anyway, just thinking about all of that. And it just brought me to a place where I'm like, man, am I living in the past? Am I moving forward? Where am I? By the end of it all, there's no answer, Ross. I just, I I just feel like I am who I am in this moment. And I feel more than anything, if any of the teachings have stuck with me, it's not to think too far ahead, and it's not to live in the past. It's really to do what you can in the moment. And I find that's what a lot of those rituals were there to teach you, was as you're bathing and the sun is rising in the morning, it's to wash away yesterday because it's done, and it's to be in the moment. And you can't control the next moment ahead of you. All you can do is just be as centered as you can be and trying to look at life in a specific way. And I just find that's my contribution through my art, is to be an artist that is pulling from what I see in real time. And can it bring people together? Can it bring awareness to what I believe in? Can it share the passion that I have for, humanity and Mother Earth at the same time? And if I have collectors who want to invest in my work, will that message stay with them? And will they feel compelled to also be like, I can do my part? And now it comes back to the question where you're like, well, how do people do their part? I find with my work, a lot of my clients now that I work with, I'm very fortunate because it starts with this conversation and they do care. And like I say, when I first started, I was using my art to pay for everything. And once we started the lwətaʔ Foundation, now those collectors contribute to the foundation. They're like, wow, I'm very moved. And I am in a position now financially where I would love to shift and transfer funds, a certain amount of funds to help with this, and it's very empowering, but it creates again that extended community where it's not just for me, Indigenous based. It's not just xʷməthkʷəy or lwətaʔ or nation based up and down the coast. It's really again about remembering what it is to be human, like coming to a place with beautiful people who just want to feel again too.
Yeah. Yeah, I love that. I feel like the federal government would take you as a bit of a rebel, though.
I think they already do. The other, what have I heard already in the past? Pain in the ass, privileged.
This has been said about you.
Yeah, been called privileged. What's his problem? Doesn't he make enough money? He's a successful artist.
Right. Why does he want more for his people?
Yeah.
I guess this kind of goes back to the definition of decolonization, how people have different definitions of that. And this popped in my mind because of you thinking of you as a rebel here. How do you define land back? Because that's also a term that people have many different definitions too. Like
everything I talked about in this podcast
is land back
for me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. By supporting Indigenous people in their reclamation to wellness, to reconnect with land, to restore their values, to be able to access, ritual, to celebrate ceremony, and to see that in all of its glory and shininess and the beauty of it all. Is something that can be shared because it's the values that bring it all together. So when I think about land back, it's really the restoration of the values we've lost along the way. And this isn't just for us here in Canada, it's global. Every Indigenous, going right back to the Irish, going back to the Scottish, right? I mean, you look at the monarch and what they've done, and it's still happening. And we look at what's happening in the Middle East, still happening. There's Indigenous people. Land back isn't about get the hell off my land. It's not about greed. It's about the restoration of values, and that how we look at corporations. It's really the removal of corporations and capitalists and governments who only want to build and monetize off of resources as they see it. Land back is really about the reclamation so we can be human, getting together. And again, it's everybody has their own interpretation. But for me, in my heart, what I try and build is the celebration of diversity. And it's looking at the ecosystems that teach me that. So going back to those early philosophical feelings and thoughts and the way our people looked at the land, we didn't know race. It was all taught. We didn't know anything other than we had a responsibility, and we welcomed Europeans and fur traders into our culture. We made fur traders hereditary chiefs. We gave them rights and privileges. They were able to negotiate on reserve, like on resources, and on and on. And it put them in the places of power until the government realized we were becoming too powerful, and put a ban on our potlatches, and then built the residential schools and took the children away. But we had a system in the early times of fur trade where it was quite lucrative until the epidemics and on and on and on. So it's really quite interesting when I look at it that way, because really our people were very open and very sharing. And because again, it came down to, that's what we're taught. We're better, we're stronger, just like the forest, if we celebrate diversity. We don't want to be just one single race on the planet. People are like, oh, we're just one human race. But it's like, no, we all have capabilities. We all celebrate, different unique abilities about us. And you can celebrate different perspectives. You can celebrate different, ways of thinking, on and on. Like it's okay. We can be in conflict and find our way through it. That's okay. We don't have to like shut the door, build a wall, and, and just like oppose of whatever, differences. It's like, how do we navigate through it all? Like there's a lot of blackberry bushes that take over, a lot of different beautiful plant gardens and stuff, and nobody's looking at it, and they're just like, well, pick the berries, make some jam,
Well, that's one of the things that I love about you and your mentality is that like you are very philosophical, deep thinker about it, but then there's also no hesitation to act. Like you're not waiting for permission from the federal government to go use your land, like you're there, you're a part of it. You're building these stories in real time, regardless of whatever kind of, toxic colonial things have kind of implanted in everybody else's mind that keeps them from maybe acting. Like, well, why do you need permission from them?
Well, I mean, once people gain strength and understand like how to fill themselves again with these values, then you start to recognize the government is the ones that's what's fake. That's not real. It's there's nothing real about government.
It's a democracy,
right? Yeah, and what is democracy?
Right.
You know what I mean? Once you get into all of these different ways of thinking, we're creating more obstacles from just really living life, and it comes back to like the real, like the essence of life itself. We all have the right to, whether we think about, whether it's the UN Declaration, for Indigenous rights and on, the rights to water, rights to identity, language, all of these things. And then I just think, I'm like, fuck, that's just human nature. I mean, we're just human beings. Don't interfere with that. That's the issue. Don't take that away from us, because that's anything else is an obstacle and it's not real. Government isn't real. Nothing is real. So when I look at laws, I'm like, there were laws built on hypocrisy. Everything is hypocrisy within itself. Everything happening around me is hypocrisy. It's all lies. The only thing real is me being on my land, trying to cultivate it and stimulate it in a way and bring community together.
And be a part of it.
It's the only fucking thing that's left that's real.
Right. Beautifully put. It's the only fucking thing that's left that's real. Yeah. Put that on a bumper sticker. I'm conscious of time here. I know you have a meeting coming up quick. Is there anything else you'd like to add or touch on that we didn't today? No, I think this has been a really good conversation. Yeah, thank you for joining me. For every podcast, I make a donation to a nonprofit of my guest's choice.
Yeah.
Who would you like this week's donation to go to?
Well,
I mean, Awina Killa already gets a lot of love.
Awina Killa is doing well. There's one that I really am enjoying on social media, and it's called
hype up someone small.
Yeah, and I think they go by Akela, and they're a small organization of youth, and they're venturing around Skszwək territory, specifically Musqueamauc, I think, on canoes, and they're teaching youth about being on canoe, wilderness training, first aid, all these things. But they're creating really beautiful programs.
Amazing.
Yeah, and I'm like,
what is it again?
Akala. So I don't know if it's AKALA maybe .com. But yeah. Anyway.
Okay, I'll throw the link to that. I'll bug you for the handle too.
Yeah. Because sometimes I'm like, how do I work with them?
Yeah. Get them involved.
Yeah, totally.
Love that. So I'll throw a link to that in the show notes for people who are curious about that. Link to that on social media. Thanks so much for taking the time to chat.
Yeah.
Love hearing from you.
Yeah. Cheers.
Awesome. I'm telling you, that guy is just a natural poet. Am I right? Once again, massive thanks to Randy for taking time out of his day to chat with me in his studio. There are a lot of links, a lot of places you can go to check out and learn more about Randy and all that he does. I'm going to list them off here, but I will also include them in the show notes, which means you can click them very easily. So if you'd like to learn more about Randy and his art, his carving work, you can do so at randecook.gallery. That's RANDECOOK.gallery. If you'd like to learn more about the Ma'amtagila Nation and their title case that they have against the federal government, you can do so at ma'amtagila.ca. That's MAAMTAGILA.ca. And if you'd like to learn more about Awinakyola, the nonprofit that we've mentioned in the past, you can do so at awinakyola.com. That's AWINAKOLA.com. So for every podcast episode, I make a donation to the nonprofit of my guest choice using funds from those who support this project on Patreon. And today, Randy chose to give his donation to the Akala Society. You can learn more about them at akalasociety.com. That's AKALASOCIETY.com. Nerdy About Nature is a passion project built for the people, by the people, and as such, it is supported wholly by folks like yourself who are enjoying this show. So if you're enjoying this Podchat series, as well as the Undercurrents podcast series that I do, all the fun educational videos you see all over Instagram, YouTube, and TikTok, you can help support the production by becoming a Patreon supporter at patreon.com/nerdyaboutnature or on Substack at substack.com/nerdyaboutnature, where you can also find some long-form written pieces that I do from time to time. And all of this goes towards supporting this project so I can continue to grow and educate people about this amazing world we all share. Thanks so much for tuning in today, and I'm looking forward to catching you next time. Cheers. This episode of the Nerdy About Nature Podchat series was produced by me, Ross Reid, and made possible with support from individuals like yourself. For ways to support this project and to learn more, check out nerdyboutnature.com or at nerdyboutnature on your favorite social platform.